This episode is about anti-Semitism and the US American left. So the debate has gained some momentum since 9/11, but it's still, as we will explore in a few minutes, kind of a slightly marginal topic. And to explore more, or to shed some light on this topic, we have two very distinguished guests today, and who have followed those developments and researched those developments, as well as intervened into those developments. And this is first Blair Taylor, who's a program director for the Institute for Social Ecology and a researcher on social movements in the far right, and Sina Arnold, who's a lecturer and researcher at the Center for Research on Anti-Semitism at the Technical University Berlin. And she has authored the book Das unsichtbare Vorurteil, Antisemitismus-Diskurse in der US-amerikanischen Linken nach 9/11, so translated into The Invisible Prejudice, Discourses of Anti-Semitism in the US Left After 9/11, and her most recent book, Anti-Semitism Discourse in the Contemporary US Left, is forthcoming with Indiana University Press. So my colleagues are Professor Gideon Reuveni, who is Professor of Modern European History and the Director of the Sussex Weidenfeld Institute of Jewish Studies, and Professor Gaber, who is Professor of Political Journalism and journalist, especially for the BBC, covering Labour Party, the left, and more recently also anti-Semitism. So we will start this episode with a brief kick-off introduction by Sina and Blair, which will be followed by questions and conversations about such topics. All right, I think Sina is first. So Sina, thank you for joining us and for being here, and the screen is yours.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation. And I think it's really great you're organizing this podcast series on this super important topic. So if we kind of look at the, features of contemporary left anti-Semitism discourse. So basically, what does the left say about anti-Semitism? How does it relate to anti-Semitism? Then I would say we have kind of five characteristics that stand out. The first and in my impression, marginal one is a form of open articulation. And I think that is rare. Nevertheless, there are examples of open articulation of anti-Semitism. You may remember some images of Occupy Wall Street occupations at Zuccotti Park in New York, where someone ran around with a banner that says Google, Jews control Wall Street, Zionists control Wall Street, and the likes of this, or where also visible Jewish people were insulted in some instances. So, the list goes on, but nevertheless, compared to kind of left-wing activity, this is rare. So if we want to understand anti-Semitism discourse, I think we have to kind of look deeper. And another feature that stands out in my mind is a certain acceptance, an acceptance of anti-Semitic speech, of anti-Semitic codes, connected to that a lack of debate, and a certain double standard compared to how the left deals with racism, with sexism, with homophobia. So again, if we take that example of Occupy Wall Street, there were certain counter demonstrators vis-a-vis this open anti-Semitism, but it's nothing compared to how the left at Occupy Wall Street, to stick with that example, dealt with sexism during the square occupations, or white supremacy in the movement, and so on and so on. So a certain acceptance of anti-Semitism as something that is not really as bad as other forms of oppression or prejudice, or however you want to call it. And I think the third feature very strongly linked to that is an absence of debate. So this is something that has changed in my mind in the last 2, 3, 4 years, given that there is a general rise in anti-Semitism in the United States, as you know, something that was certainly enabled by the Trump administration and its rhetoric, and also its support of the radical right. And as you know, in Pittsburgh, in New York, in New Jersey, there has been violent attacks against Jews, deadly attacks against Jews. So anti-Semitism there's more general awareness that this is something that in the United States, which for a long time, seemed to be this kind of exceptional country, is something that is possible. Nevertheless, until very recently, there's really few and far the articles that reflect upon anti-Semitism from the left and on the left are really few and far between, especially if we look at that period from 9/11 until recently. And linked to this, and I would say that's kind of the fourth feature, is a certain defensiveness. There are numerous examples for that. So in the cases where left actors, progressive actors were approached with accusations of anti-Semitism, the kind of the absence of wanting to engage with this. So one case was Linda Sarsour, who was on the organizing committee of the Women's March, and who has been close to Islamist actors, and who got accused of anti-Semitism. And kind of the left reactions were not so much engaging with these accusations and looking at them, wondering, are they wrong, are they false, engaging in like actual factual arguments, but rather like a reflexive defensiveness. There was this hashtag that rose up, I stand with Linda. There were many articles that from the very beginning made clear, if anyone tries to accuse the left of anti-Semitism, it can only be of bad faith. It can only be a Zionist plot in order to defend Israel. And the fifth feature, and I think kind of result, is the possible potential effect of exclusion that can have on Jewish activists, and certainly not on all of them. I mean, all of these discourses that we will talk about, Jewish activists, Jewish leftists are also actively involved. So it's really not a clear-cut division along identity lines. Nevertheless, there are also numerous examples. To pick the Chicago Dyke March from a few years ago, just as one of them, where Jewish activists, Jewish lesbians, flew a rainbow flag that had the Star of David in it, and were expelled from the march with the argumentation that what they carry is a Zionist symbol that triggered emotions by Palestinian and other members of the march. However, from these Jewish women carried the rainbow flag with the Star of David as a symbol for what they called being proud Jewish dykes, which was the kind of the t-shirt, what the t-shirt said of one of them. So it was a symbol of their identity as Jewish women, as Jewish lesbians, and this was at a leftist queer event where identity and the diversity of identity certainly was embraced, where a lot of kind of ethnic and racial identities were something that were encouraged, that were seen as something that people could feel and should feel proud of. Nevertheless, one identity, specifically a Jewish identity, was not welcome there. So, again, one of many examples that we are happy to go into later, meaning the effect of exclusion on the part of Jewish Jewish activists is certainly there. And at the heart of this is something that I would call anti-Semitic trivialization, meaning kind of an indifference and a lack of empathy towards anti-Semitism, a lack of empathy for Jewish concerns. And I think that is kind of the key problem, not so much that an open anti-Semitism. I don't think the American left is anti-Semitic. I think that's I know there are some authors and some political actors that think that. I don't think that's the key problem. I don't think it gets us anywhere. I think the lack is what I would call anti-Semitic trivialization, and that is nothing particularly new. So if we look at the history also of inner left or of criticism towards the left, there were numerous commentators in the New Left that spoke of an anti-Semitism of indifference in the 60s. There's a viral discussion amongst Jewish feminists of the 80s who spoke of something like the hidden disease of the movement, of an anti-Semitism by omission. So, you know, something that has a kind of tradition in the American left. And I think we see the effects of that. The effect that means a downplaying of ignoring and downplaying the question of worldwide anti-Semitism in the Arab world, in Europe, but also in the United States, and a displacement that occurs when talking about anti-Semitism. And this is something, you know, my research is based on qualitative interviews with activists, and I saw kind of a discursive shift whenever I try to engage and talk about anti-Semitism, this discursive shift towards talking about racism on the one hand, or towards accusations of anti-Semitism on the other hand. So some, you know, not taking anti-Semitism seriously as a topic for the left in and out of itself.
I just briefly wanted to add, I guess, a few themes where some of these topics pop up, and also maybe a few more recent developments that you kind of alluded to. I mean, you mentioned the Tree of Life shooting. We might also mention the Unite the Right rally with the chant of Jews will not replace us. I think these two events in particular were kind of a wake-up call to the American left. That after, you know, we started doing these workshops together, Sina, some years ago, it was kind of seen as this esoteric topic. Why are you talking about this at all? This is just really bizarre. This is always, you know, secondary to Islamophobia and to anti-Black racism, other issues that are more pressing. And it was greeted with a lot of, you know, general suspicion. And I think since 2018, 2019, there's at least been an acknowledgement that there is a rise in actual anti-Semitism happening. And from the left, like that they're acknowledging this is happening, but they only will focus on the anti-Semitism of the right. They're much, much less likely to look at anti-Semitism from within their own ranks. And as you mentioned, are typically defensive in ways that kind of illustrate a bunch of different double standards, which are really unusual for the left, especially when we're talking about the usually very sensitive discussions of race, racism, and identity. So I think you already mentioned, of course, Israel-Palestine issue that we'll go into in more depth. That's, of course, perhaps the largest vector, we might say, for potentially anti-Semitic discourse. I think those organizations, some of the organizations have taken up this kind of challenge. I would mention groups like Bend the Arc, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, and the recently relaunched Jewish Left magazine, Jewish Currents, all as some of the folks that are trying to explicitly grapple with anti-Semitism from a left-wing perspective. And some of the works, some of the groups are better than others, or at least trying to grapple with this. But again, there are some real blind spots there. And I think a lot of that has to do with this kind of what's become a mantra on the left, in many sections of the left, is that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. And I think what we've seen, especially since the last Gaza conflict, we've seen a massive spike in overt, explicit anti-Semitic violence, abuse, vandalism, whatnot, that was not directed at Israelis or the Israeli government, but just at Jews. So we saw most recently a group of Jewish diners in Los Angeles that were attacked by a pro-Palestinian group or mob. We've seen attacks in New York City. We've seen just a massive spike of vandalism and abuse all across the United States and Canada. And I think this should obviously really trouble the kind of left's responsive mantra of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are always and forever distinct things. This has shown that actually there is quite a bit of bleed, and it should have frankly been obvious before, when you had far-right anti-Semitic actors like David Duke, you know, not fully abandoning the overt language of anti-Semitism, but also embracing increasingly an anti-Zionist perspective instead, and getting a lot more traction with that. So that at one point, you know, when Ilhan Omar was in the news for some of her comments about it's all about the Benjamins and the Jewish lobby control everything here, you know, his webpage was functionally indistinguishable from the left-wing socialist magazine Jacobin, which was just both of them emblazoned Ilhan Omar did nothing wrong in bold letters, and, you know, Zionist lobby, you know, victorious again, etc. So there's quite a bit of discursive overlap, to the point where I think this instinctive idea on the left that we know who the real anti-Semites are and what the problem is starts to get undermined, because it may look like that from within those circles, but from outside, the discourse is really different. So I just want to mention two other, or maybe in some ways one other important vector for these current conversations, and those are in conversations around racism, anti-racism, and identity. So you already mentioned the Women's March, which was marred from its inception for its omission of discussing anti-Semitism, and then subsequent revelations came out that there was even some more perhaps targeted and overt anti-Semitism in some of the very early foundational meetings, in addition to their willingness, like you said, to work with Louis Farrakhan, known anti-Semite. So there's this kind of like hierarchy of oppressions where on the one hand, Jewish oppression and Jewish history is written out largely on the basis of being white, and the kind of predominance of critical whiteness theory and focus on white privilege as a master frame that, as white people, they can only be the oppressor, not the oppressed. And then I think related to that was the idea that, well, Jews are the victims par excellence due to the Holocaust and due to the commemoration of the Holocaust. So if anything, we need to decenter Jewish suffering and lift up other forms of suffering. And we really should put this to the side because it's sucking up all the air out of the room, and and they're ultimately, after all, white, which of course is, we know, not true. And then I think another aspect of this is the rise of the kind of intersectionality discourse, which is supposed to be looking at the ways multiple identities intersect in oppressive and dominating ways, or in ways that give other groups power. There's been a curious tendency, I would say, in left-wing intersectional movements, whether that's the Women's March, in some sectors of the climate justice movement, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, that in many ways they intersect on anti-Zionism in a way that replicates all the kind of historic tropes about Jews, or in this case, the Jewish state, which of course we can see racism takes coded forms, as kind of the master evil, that all evil emanates from this, that in many cases the intersection is on Israel, which should at the very least, raise some alarm bells, I would say. And then, so the other kind of trend, I think, is maybe the newest frontier in contemporary anti-racist discourse on the left is the discourse of decolonization. And in many ways, this fuses this somewhat previously domestic anti-racist or identity politics orientation with this external focus on foreign policy fixated on Israel, so that now Jews are not only seen as white people, but they're also seen as colonizers, and Israel, of course, is the settler colonial state par excellence, with a special relationship to the other settler colonial state of the United States. So it really fuses these two in a way, and there's, especially in relation to the most recent conflict, been a lot of kind of not only just conflation of Jews with Israel, but seeing Jews everywhere as colonizers. And this popped up in one interesting example a few months back. Anne Frank was trending suddenly on Twitter. People were asking why, and there was this fairly obscure anti-colonial group of quasi-Maoists called Black Hammer that was basically saying Anne Frank was a colonizer, and the real victims of oppression are Palestinians, and Anne Frank, F Anne Frank, she was America, and blah blah blah, white supremacy, colonization. So you see this relativization and an omission of Jewish suffering, and recasting them, in fact, as kind of the vanguard of colonization. So some of these things are the discursive tendencies that are coming to a head, I think, right now in the American left. And the Jewish Currents, I'll end with this comment about Jewish Currents. This recently relaunched Jewish Left magazine published, in my view, a very terrible op-ed maybe 2 months ago, called How to Fight Anti-Semitism, or How Not to Fight Anti-Semitism, which was a response to the book by Weiss. And basically was saying, don't take it seriously. And this is coming from supposedly the main outlet of the American left, saying that, once again, this is a distraction from the real problem, Islamophobia, anti-Black racism. American Jews have never had it so good. Just basically shut up and stop complaining. And so that is obviously a very dangerous tendency within the left. And that, there's a specific role being played by certain, Jewish left actors in perpetuating at least a blindness to that, if not actual anti-Semitism. Okay, so I'm just going to stop there, and I look forward to opening up the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously agree with everything that that you say, Blair, and I just wanted to add to this, the fact that on the left, there's this understanding that anti-Zionism can never be anti-Semitic. And I find that so surprising. To this day, I find it so surprising, especially against the backdrop that there's a lot of knowledge on the left regarding the subtlety of racism. that, you know, there has been a shift, generally speaking, in how in kind of Western liberal society prejudice is uttered. It's not uttered anymore in a very open fashion. That is kind of taboo. So there's, you know, ways to navigate that. There's ways to talk about welfare queens and thugs and inner urban crime, you know the term better, but instead of talking about Blacks, or, you know, and so on and so on. So I still find it amazing that it's so hard to acknowledge that one way of acceptably uttering anti-Semitism can be to talk about the Jewish state. And I'm not saying that that is always the case, and I'm not saying anti-Zionism is necessarily anti-Semitic, but it can be. And, you know, I think the left has an understanding when it comes to other forms of prejudice or ideology. And I think that really points to also developments within the left, and something that I find useful. Shulamit Volkov, the anti-Semitism scholar, who has coined that term of the cultural code to speak of anti-Semitism in the German Empire in the 19th century, kind of applied that to what happened after 67, where anti-Semitism became what she called a subcultural code. So it stood, and I think to this day that is true for the American left, that it's much more than kind of a realpolitik position on what's going on over there, but it means you stand on the right side of history. You're against racism, you're against colonialism, you're against imperialism, you're against white supremacy, and all of that kind of fuses into being an anti-Zionist.
But there is an understanding that anti-Semitism in the US was much less important or less strong than in, for example, Europe or any other countries for a certain specific reason, or for the way the United States has been has developed. And I would like to ask you whether you would say that this has some truth, that there was a kind of a different story in the United States, and that has kind of escalated or turned more into a conventional form of anti-Semitism, left-wing anti-Semitism, as you have described it, or whether you would say this image itself is wrong or is false, to say that the United States was different or exceptional with regard to anti-Semitism and left-wing anti-Semitism in particular. Maybe you can elaborate a bit on this.
My sense is that there's one tradition on the left that is not as kind of not as visible in the US, which is kind of a reactionary anti-capitalism. There is a tradition that I would say kind of originates in the populist movement at the turn of the 20th century. So kind of agrarian collectives that already then kind of rallied against big money, big industry, and that, you know, and then that also got picked up by the right, by Henry Ford's anti-Semitism, certainly. And I could hear echoes of that in Occupy Wall Street, with this kind of, you know, pitting Main Street versus Wall Street was one of the slogans, you know, putting bad finance capital against the kind of good mom and dad pop stores and mom and pop stores, pop-up store, you know what I mean, mom and pop stores. And so, but my sense is that kind of this anti-capitalist anti-Semitism has stronger traditions in Europe, in mainstream society, especially in Germany, but also on the left. I don't see that so much in American mainstream society, for sure, which might have to do with like a kind of general, more pro-capitalist outlook. I mean, there's some scholars that claim that. Yeah, and you know, there are examples of it on the left, but when we look at what is kind of what are the origins, what are the dominating themes on the US left in regard to anti-Semitism, I don't see that so much. And kind of looking back 10 years ago, I would also say, given that Occupy Wall Street was like an explicit anti-capitalist movement, anti-Semitism, in my perception, played a kind of subordinate role in how that discourse was framed and the reactionary aspect.
Thank you for this, also for this kind of historical tour de force. But I will now pass on to Ivor or Gideon, who wants to ask the next question. Ivor, please.
I just want to run through very quickly 3 or 4 issues in British left anti-Semitism, for your comments on whether this resonates in the United States. Firstly, Jeremy Corbyn, who I'm sure you know was the leader of the Labour Party and brought the issue of left anti-Semitism ahead, was often criticised by Jews and others when whenever he said we are totally opposed to anti-Semitism, he would then add as a rider and all forms of racism. And certainly people on the left felt, not people on the left, sorry, Jews felt that by melding it into and all forms of racism, he was undermining it, belittling it, making it not important, just saying, look, of course we're anti-racist, end of. Whereas his supporters wanted to make the point that anti-Semitism is no different from other forms of racism, which I think is arguable, but I'd be interested if that is an issue. The second one is, we talk about anti-Zionism, but there is a great debate, a range of what does it mean in this country. Does anti-Zionism at one level mean we hate Netanyahu, or now we talk we're in post-Netanyahu times, I hope. We don't like the Israeli government. To the other extreme is Israel has no right to exist. And so there's a cloudiness, a fog about what the understanding of anti-Zionism means. I mean, I would say that being profoundly opposed to the policies of the present Israeli government is obviously not anti-Semitic, but questioning the right of Israel to exist is arguably is. The third very brief one is the Palestinian flag has been is pretty ubiquitous. I just happened to notice a woman on the train with a face mask that had a Palestinian flag. I was very tempted to say, do you know what that flag is that you're wearing? Because it's become almost a universal sign, particularly amongst young people, of a symbol of resistance. It's all wrapped up with Black Lives Matter and the debate about trans and so forth. And it's so I just wonder how potent has the Palestinian flag become as part of the left anti-Semitism in the US? And finally, I just wonder how the issue of Black and Arab and Asian and other non-white privileged Jews, or Israelis in particular, are dealt with. Because obviously oppression of the Mizrahi, of Arab Jews in Israel is an issue. And there are Black Jews one encounters. So I don't know how much of an issue that is. So there are 4 very quick UK left anti-Semitic issues that I would be interested in your comments on.
Yeah, the Corbyn example is interesting because, of course, we had Bernie Sanders running at the same time on a similar left populist platform, but obviously as a Jew, and also as someone who's been in the past criticized from the left for not denouncing Israel's existence enough, and yet later was criticized for being too critical of Israel, especially in his second run. So interesting, complicated dynamic. But what I mostly notice is there is a deep reluctance. You mentioned Corbyn always having to have an addendum. And there was just an example actually just in the last 2 weeks, I believe, of a similar case happening here. And also this circles back to your third point about Jews of color. So a woman named April Powers, who was a spokesperson of some kind for the Society of Children's Books and Children's Book Illustrators, made a public Facebook post in the midst of the recent spike in anti-Semitic violence, saying we stand with all Jews. This anti-Semitism is indefensible, etc. And she got fired because there was such a backlash saying, why didn't you also mention Islamophobia? Why didn't you mention specifically violence against Palestinians? Why didn't you And she was just like, wow, I mean, you can get fired for just mentioning anti-Semitism, bereft of anything else. And I think that's a very common impulse you see. When the left does address it, it often doesn't address it in terms that anti-Semitism is actually harmful to Jews. It's harmful to Blacks and to Muslims and to migrants, because the far right holds Jews responsible for the rise of these. So if you want to fight these primary problems, you have to fight anti-Semitism. It doesn't really say much about Jews themselves, or it's bad for the movement as a whole, for the unity. So those things are definitely live. They take maybe slightly different forms. You mentioned the existence of Israel. I mean, one thing that's, and then the flag mask. I mean, it's very striking that people seem completely uncritical that they could laud one national liberation movement and then completely denounce another without in my view, any awareness that in fact Zionism was a national liberation movement, and that, you know, Palestinian national movement is, you know, has a set of similar and competing claims, and they don't seem, there seems to be very little analysis of, you know, how do we suss out those claims? It's just a simple morality play. And this goes back to the decolonial aspect, which gets bound up with contemporary debates about racism. They're an indigenous people, Jews are settler colonizers, completely erasing the history of, you know, Jewish history in the region, into this very flat and ahistorical narrative. And one's good, one's bad, end of story. Sina, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't really have much to add. I mean, you know, regarding your question on anti-Zionism, your impression is totally correct that, you know, it becomes this all-encompassing term, and everything is lumped under it, the same way that everything is lumped under that label of Zionists. And, you know, that's, I guess, also what I meant with this subcultural code. It's not so much an analytical category. And I mean, we'd have to add also from the right often, you know, I mean, there's also no distinction between what did anti-Zionism mean before the founding of the State of Israel? What does it mean now? You know, it's not been the same thing. So we have to be historically very specific what we mean by it. And also today, I mean, there's, you know, various positions that you also hinted at that can be lumped under that label, but they mean very different things. And regarding Jews of color, my impression is that in the United States there's more kind of the attempt of kind of visibility by Jews of color. There's been more kind of networks and attempts at showing that Jews in the United States are not necessarily white, but when it comes to kind of the perception of Israel and Jews in Israel, then certainly, and you know, this is linked to the black and white binary. Israel is a white settler colonial state, and this totally, yeah, eradicates the fact that not everyone in Israel is Jewish, and not all the Jews in Israel are Ashkenazim. So this, you know, it's also something that doesn't look at kind of the diversity of Israeli society, and that also, of course, ends up playing out in some interpretations or some applications of BDS, where, you know, it's not just I don't know, not boycotting hummus from the settlements or whatever, but actually boycotting Israeli, I don't know, academic institutions. Never mind the fact that a lot of the Israelis working there are progressive and critical of their government and so on, but they're lumped in under that label of what Israel is supposedly, namely a white settler colonial apartheid state.
You know, there's a very strong image in all of us living outside of the United States that actually there's still no socialism or no kind of actually real left in the United States. And it's interesting also about Zombart himself, that he himself, you know, 5 years after publishing that essay, he published this big book on capitalism and the Jews. And he himself also kind of went through this journey from the left to the right, which actually brings me to, you know, the kind of obvious question that we actually also discussed in the previous podcasts is as to whether we need to be worried about this phenomenon of anti-Semitism in the left in the United States. I mean, is this something which, because I think it was kind of hinted in your presentations that, you know, it's not, you know, how dominant these groups or these views are, or is it something that, you know, is played out in, you know, in campuses, you know, in a way at the margins of mainstream America? And I'm kind of asking myself if you can comment on that.
It depends on what we mean by worried. In general, yeah, I think it's something we should care about and reflect upon and fight, and yes, be worried about. And it has effects on Jews. You know, I don't think it has any kind of, it will have any kind of deadly implications the way that anti-Semitism on the right has shown in the last few years. So, you know, I think it makes sense to definitely put that into perspective when we talk about kind of where does the threat of anti-Semitism come from. But nevertheless, it is something that yes, we need to observe. And certainly when we look at campus anti-Semitism, there are some studies that show there's been an increase, and there is this increased also perception by Jewish students that they don't feel welcome or don't feel safe on campus. And we know that when we look at kind of groups like students or movements like Students for Justice in Palestine, in the last 20 years, by now they have, you know, over 220 groups on American or North American campuses, or Turtle Island campuses, as they recently rebranded their campaign. So there, you know, that is something that is definitely increasing. And also, I mean, this is the other point I always try to make. I mean, one thing is that I think it's important to deal with these things that we described, these developments, because of the anti-Semitism they imply. But I think another thing is that they also say a lot about kind of faulty analysis of in left thinking. I mean, you know, why is there this predominance of looking at everything through kind of this the color line? Why is there this pitting of good nationalism against bad nationalism? Why are there certain forms of foreshortened critiques of capitalism? Why is there a, you know, a kind of one-sided analysis of imperialism that can only see it as a Western phenomenon and not take into account other forms of imperialism that have been and are there, and so on and so on. So I think dealing with anti-Semitism on the left is also something that can make the left more self-critical, more self-reflexive in many other analytical areas that are important when we want to understand and possibly change society. So, you know, that is another reason why I'm kind of interested in bringing forward this critique, because I'm also, and that's, you know, I kind of started off the presentation, I'm also surprised at why that is possible on the left. And it's not because every leftist is an anti-Semite, it's because there's a lot of kind of twisted ways of thinking and of looking at the world.
I have introduced the two of you as being political activists in left-wing movements, but also as very critical towards left-wing anti-Semitism, or anti-Semitism in general, but also left-wing anti-Semitism. And the question so remains: what can be done about all of this?
You know, I'm from Germany. There's been a very lively, very heated debate around anti-Semitism on the left here, since for the last over 20 years by now, and it's been brutal and bitter in some ways. A lot of kind of friendships split over it, and you know, it had large effects on the left in positive and in negative ways, and a lot of it was very confrontational. So even though usually that is not my style, looking back, I would say apparently that was successful, that some people, some groups just wouldn't let go and kind of reminded the rest of the left that they have a problem. So I guess that is something that that needs to be done on a kind of more hippie-esque note, something that I definitely note in the US left. I mean, maybe Blair, you can say something to that as well, because you've been living there in the last few years, and I'm back here, but that's given against the threat of the right, the rise of anti-Semitism under Trump, the rise of the radical right, there have been new coalitions, and, you know, specifically also Jewish Black coalitions. I mean, the ADL and the NAACP recently have, like, or not recently, after the Trump inauguration, have kind of said, you know, we want to rebuild this coalition from the civil rights movement. And there have been campaigns that kind of realized if the radical right and with their notion of, you know, the idea of the great exchange, and you remember the Pittsburgh attacker, he had this idea that it's Jews, and specifically the highest, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, that bring in immigrants and Muslims to the United States and therefore undermine the white majority. So if the radical right manages to bring these groups together, then, you know, we better damn well build up coalitions and come out of kind of this notion of competition between different kind of minorities, different victim groups, and my sense is that that had implications. It's no coincidence that the number of articles on anti-Semitism, not just from the right, but also in the left and from within the left, has risen, because there is a greater awareness of anti-Semitism in general. And I think that's a good thing. And it could be that in the next few years, we'll see some changes in the left, because there's a general awareness of anti-Semitism, unfortunately, due to the developments from the right and the deadly effects that had.
Yeah, just briefly, I know we're already going long. I would just second that and say, maybe it sounds cliche, but I think education is important. We need to challenge these discourses, and we need to offer better analyses, whether that's a more complicated and historically nuanced understanding of the Israel-Palestine conflict or the Middle East or colonialism in general, whether that's updating our understandings of anti-racist theory and praxis so that it makes space for anti-Semitism. And all of this requires a certain kind of like bravery and boldness to challenge, I would say, what Adorno called the ticket thinking on the left, where you just kind of check the boxes. It all goes together, because I think we could both attest, Sina, that you don't make a lot of friends bringing these questions up on the left. You get denounced as a Zionist, troll. There's even a term for it, hasbara. You speak only to defend Israel. And pretty much every time we've done this workshop, we get that accusation, or we bring things up in online forums or in person movements. A few years ago, a friend of ours spoke at the DSA gathering, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and he was one of the very few people to try to take a principled anti-national solidarity stand against the BDS endorsement, and just thousands and thousands of people raining booze down on him, which was the only time it happened the entire thing. But I think, so it requires a little bit of bravery to intervene and to challenge these things, as Sina mentioned, that happened in the German left in a very, proactive form. But also being open to communicating with your partners and your organizations and other movements, and trying to find that shared ground, but not relenting. Because whenever I also make these points, I always get these private messages. Oh, I feel the same way, but I just don't want to speak out. I don't want to challenge the kind of conventional wisdom of the left. But unfortunately, if we look around, the conventional wisdom of the American left and the global left hasn't been doing us any favors. We're not exactly doing, we're not in power, we're not winning, we're on the defensive. So I think challenging some of these things, as Sina said, is in fact central to the left having a more international, nuanced, cosmopolitan, universalist perspective that actually speaks to people, like broad swaths of people.
Thank you very much for this very intriguing depiction and analysis of left-wing anti-Semitism in the US. So this was the third episode, as I have said, of the 3-episode series so far. We have spoken about the British experience. We have talked about Germany, and now about the US. And it has become clear that all of the countries, all of the regions have differences and specifics, but also some commonalities, and which is quite recently the rise of the conflation of anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, and the problems we have to differentiate what is actually a critique on Israeli policy or Israeli government on the one hand, or what is anti-Semitic or anti-Zionism which has an anti-Semitic undertone. And these things are recurring, but also the question which we have discussed, and maybe a bit more in the first 2 episodes, in how much actually a certain understanding of capitalism and the bourgeois society in left-wing analysis, or in left-wing left-wing theory has tied into certain anti-Semitic tropes, or had played with anti-Semitic tropes. And here in this case in the US, we have more talked about anti-Zionism and how that has become a major issue in the left-wing movement, but also in the general US public. But not to say that this is also like a certain kind of a difficult understanding of capitalism and bourgeois society is still inherent. It's also inherent in the US American left. So there have been many topics, and we have not dealt with all of them. conclusively and comprehensively, but we have tried to address some of these issues. It has become clear that left-wing anti-Semitism is a problem, even though all of us acknowledge that right-wing anti-Semitism in most cases is more deadly, is more aggressive, and has produced more victims, but on the other hand, left-wing anti-Semitism is still a problem, especially if you look at the people who are usually the ones who are against racism and anti-Semitism. These are left-wing movements, and we shouldn't allow anti-Semitism to compromise this general stance. So it's not a full summary, but just to kind of bring together the three first episodes we've had. For this, for now, I have to thank you, and I'm very grateful for your wonderful comments, for your wonderful introduction and the conversation, the two of you, Sina and Blair, but also to Gideon and Ivor. Thank you very much. And that's all I have to say, and have a wonderful evening. And take care.